أهلا بكم مشاهدينا إلى هذه الحلقة الجديدة من مستقبل الطاقة. هذه عناويننا. بعد انسحابات وإلغاءات للهيدروجين النظيف في 2025، البعض يتوقع بأن الأسوأ أصبح خلفنا. هل يمكن للهيدروجين الأخضر السعودي المنافسة في السوق الألمانية؟ عاش قطاع الهيدروجين منخفض الكربون عاما صعبا في 2025، مخيبا آمال العديدين ممن راهنوا عليه كوقود قادر على مساعدة العديد من الصناعات ذات الانبعاثات صعبة الخفض على نزع الكربون منها، مثل صناعات الطيران وإنتاج الصلب والشحن البري الطويل، إلى جانب التكرير والأسمدة. فقد تم تجميد أو إلغاء نحو 60 مشروعا العام الماضي، يبلغ حجم إنتاجها الإجمالي نحو 4.9 مليون طن سنويا من الهيدروجين النظيف منخفض الكربون بحسب S&P Global، وهو حجم يعادل أكثر من 4 أضعاف حجم الإنتاج العالمي الحالي، حيث يشهد القطاع ارتفاعاً في التكاليف وحالة عدم يقين مرتبطة بواقع الدعم الحكومي، هذا بالإضافة إلى عدم تبلور الطلب. فقد أعلنت الشهر الماضي BP عن انسحابها من مشاريع لإنتاج الهيدروجين منخفض الكربون في كل من سلطنة عمان وبريطانيا وأستراليا. وفي نوفمبر الماضي أعلنت إكسون موبل عن تجميد العمل في إنشاء مصنع للهيدروجين في تكساس كان ليكون من بين الأكبر في العالم. كما أعلنت شركة تصنيع الصلب العملاقة أرسلر ميتال في يونيو الماضي عن إلغاء مصنعين لإنتاج الهيدروجين الأخضر في ألمانيا بالرغم من دعم حكومي مقدم ب1.3 مليار يورو، معللة ذلك بأن الهيدروجين الأخضر لا يبدو بأنه لديه فرصة للنمو في ظل الظروف الحالية. نذكركم مشاهدينا بأن الهيدروجين منخفض الكربون ينقسم بالأساس إلى نوعين، الأول هو الهيدروجين الأخضر المنتج من خلال فصل الهيدروجين من الماء باستخدام الكهرباء من الطاقات المتجددة، أما النوع الثاني فهو الهيدروجين الأزرق الذي يتضمن فصل الهيدروجين من الغاز الطبيعي باستخدام الحرارة واحتجاز ثاني أكسيد الكربون الناتج عن هذه العملية. إلغاء وتجميد المشاريع يبرز التحديات التي لا تزال تعتري هذه التقنيات التي تعتبر إحدى الحلول المأمولة في خفض الانبعاثات. فقد واجهت صناعة الهيدروجين منخفضة الكربون صعوبة في إبرام عقود شراء مسبقة من العملاء، حيث لا تزال أسعار الأخضر مثلا نحو ضعفي الهيدروجين التقليدي المنتج من الوقود الأحفوري من دون احتجاز للانبعاثات. فلا رغبة حتى الآن لدى العملاء بسداد هذه العلاوة السعرية. كما أن السياسات الحكومية المرتبطة بهذا القطاع باتت غير مؤكدة، بالرغم من أن التمويل الحكومي العالمي الذي وجه نحو الأبحاث والتطوير في الهيدروجين ما بين عامي 2020 إلى 2024 بلغ نحو 10 مليارات دولار بحسب وكالة الطاقة الدولية. فمثلا ترامب قام بخفض الدعم الموجه إلى مشاريع الطاقات المتجددة المعلنة في عهد سلفه بايدن، تلك المشاريع التي كان بالإمكان أن تغذي إنتاج الهيدروجين الأخضر. هناك أكثر من 2600 مشروع للهيدروجين منخفض الكربون قد تم الإعلان عنه حتى نهاية عام 2024 بحسب وكالة الطاقة الدولية، تركزت خصوصا في الدول التي تنعم بوفرة الطاقات الشمسية والهوائية مثل مصر وموريتانيا وأستراليا. وقد تم التعهد باستثمارات بلغت 110 مليارات دولار مرتبطة بنحو 500 مشروع منها، وذلك بحسب مجلس الهيدروجين. لكن العوامل التي عقدت الصناعة آمالها عليها وهي نمو الطلب وانخفاض التكاليف لم تتحقق. البعض يرى بأن هذه التطورات لا تقضي على فرص الهيدروجين منخفض الكربون مستقبلا، لكنها تعيد الواقعية إلى الجداول الزمنية المتفائلة التي توقعها البعض لجعل الهيدروجين الأخضر وقودا تجاريا. لكن مما لا شك فيه بأن بعد الحماسة المفرطة في عام 2024 والاصطدام بالواقع في 2025 يبدو بأن عام 2026 سيكون عام إعادة التقييم الشامل لكل عناصر الجدوى التجارية لمشاريع الهيدروجين منخفض الكربون. لماذا إذن شهد قطاع الهيدروجين النظيف عاما صعبا في 2025؟ وهل فعلا لا يوجد استعداد لدى العملاء بدفع ما يسمى بالعلاوة الخضراء للهيدروجين النظيف؟ ولماذا قامت عدد من كبرى شركات النفط الدولية بتقليص أو إلغاء انكشافها على هذا القطاع مؤخرا؟ سألنا رئيس قسم أبحاث الهيدروجين في وود ماكنزي السيد موراي دوغلاس لنتابع هذا اللقاء الذي وقف على مسببات تلك التحديات.
I think what we're really seeing is that if we just look at that actual willingness to pay for what's essentially a very high cost molecule, and the willingness to pay over and above the incumbent fuel cost, plus even the cost of carbon cost where that's available, that willingness has just evaporated over the last year in particular. And it's probably then just quite important to think about some of the factors that spurred that, what many would call the green premium. There's a number of different factors that fed into that, whether that was around, maybe stronger alignment on things like climate change policies, whether it was shareholder pressure to lower emissions and pivot more towards the energy transition, or whether it was technology progress, affordability. And actually what we've just seen over the last year, of course, is that a lot of those things have simply started to unwind. And so, I think your question is correct, that we probably are at that peak of where that willingness to pay has gone, and we have hit something of a ceiling. We do expect that to come back. It will eventually come back. What's really difficult is to really understand when, in particular, it's going to come back. And there are still policy supports out there that will force a willingness to pay, if you like. But those policies are more penalty related. So two good examples in Europe with the aviation and marine fuels, where there will be penalty costs if you don't meet targets and don't meet the rules, and that will essentially provide a willingness to pay in some cases.
With funding available but projects stalling, is weak demand-side policy now the primary constraint on hydrogen FIDs rather than capital or technology?
I would say yes, partly, but actually I think it's it's really the challenges that you face across the whole value chain, from production to midstream to the end consumer. And one of the things that we're seeing very regularly is this issue around the lack of infrastructure that increases the risks for the off-takers, but also increases the risk for the producers. And so, even in some of the markets where we've got very generous subsidy supports in place, the producers actually they still have quite a lot of risk to carry, because if that off-taker fails, they don't necessarily then have the infrastructure to access another off-taker. And likewise, an off-taker will in most cases be linked to one producer. If that producer fails, they don't then have access to another. So that's an ongoing challenge that the industry faces. Like I say, those subsidies can help, but it's a heavy burden for what are, in many cases, some sort of cash-strapped governments. One of the things we always look at and talk about is the implementation of a carbon cost can help, and it helps competitiveness. But even in a market like Europe, where you have very well established carbon market, there's a cost on carbon. It is traded, so there is still that level of uncertainty around what level of cost a carbon emission is going to be. And so one of the things that we're often talking to policymakers, to industry about, is that would something like a carbon price floor maybe help and get over some of those hurdles in terms of progressing projects towards an FID.
So should the recent pullback by major energy and industrial players, the likes of BP, should it be seen as a temporary capital discipline or as a deeper reassessment of hydrogen's commercial viability?
It's really both, because some of those energy majors, they are absolutely refocusing their capital allocation. But in most cases, they've also just simply struggled to structure competitive low carbon hydrogen projects, and that's really about the nascency of the market. We're still very, very early stage. But what we should also remember is if you look at some of those big major energy players, the industrial players, what can also be seen as a retrenchment is also, what we expected anyway, where there's also a narrowing of portfolios, and they're simply now focusing on the strongest opportunities, the strongest projects in their portfolio. So we do need to remember that many companies are simply going through that process that we really expected. I think, that maybe the other interesting point to note is that when we look at the portfolios of some of those large energy majors as well, is that we've really seen a bit of a retrenchment around some of the very large scale opportunities that they had. So, of course, those sorts of companies, they have great experience, great expertise to deliver very large engineering heavy projects. But in the case of low carbon hydrogen, they were encountering a lot of these first of a kind challenges. And that was also a problem that they were facing. So if you also look at those portfolios, what you'll also see is that, not just a narrowing of focus, but a narrowing of focus into smaller, more manageable projects, trying to get the learnings in before they then take on some of those larger, more challenging projects in the future.
نتوقف مع فاصل قصير نتابع من بعده في مستقبل الطاقة. تكلفة إنتاج الهيدروجين الأخضر في السعودية أقل بنحو 25% مقارنة بألمانيا. أهلا بكم مشاهدينا من جديد. نعود لمتابعة لقائنا مع رئيس قسم أبحاث الهيدروجين في وود ماكنزي موراي دوغلاس لمناقشة وضع قطاع الهيدروجين النظيف عالميا، وسألناه بداية لماذا سيكون التركيز هذا العام على قرارات الاستثمار النهائية المرتبطة بمشاريع الأمونيا الخضراء، وكيف سيكون ذلك عاملا حاسما لقطاع الهيدروجين الأخضر هذا العام. لنتابع.
As we've just talked about, Europe's set some rules. They make producing hydrogen in Europe expensive. If we look at some of the big potential markets for hydrogen, which is essentially Europe and those Northeast Asian markets of Japan and Korea, they've all set aggressive, strong targets for hydrogen. However, those markets are also some of the most expensive places to produce hydrogen. Whereas if we look at some of the markets with low-cost gas resource or some of the most competitive renewable resources, they can produce low-carbon hydrogen at the lowest cost. And so what we then come to is that, moving hydrogen between markets it's in quite simple terms, it's just difficult and it's expensive. The most competitive way to move that hydrogen is through ammonia. So you take the low-carbon hydrogen, convert it to ammonia, put it onto a ship, move it to where it's being required, and then you can either use it directly as ammonia, for example, if you were taking it into the fertilizer industry, but you can also crack it back from ammonia to hydrogen. Now, even though that's a very expensive and inefficient process from end to end, because some of these other markets, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be China or India, because they can produce the hydrogen at such a low cost, even going through that process and delivering it and cracking it back to hydrogen, that can be more competitive than local production in some of these markets. And so what we're really beginning to see this year is that the interest and the attention on those ammonia crackers is heightening, not just from the off-takers themselves, but also those large-scale exporters that need to find a way to access the most customers and secure the highest cost. And so cracking ammonia crackers will help to unlock some of that value that's potentially on offer.
Let's discuss some of those large-scale potential exporters. How are weak demand signals from Europe and Asia reshaping low-carbon hydrogen plans in the Middle East, in countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar? And what does this mean for the regions, for the Middle East region's long-term role in the hydrogen sector?
Yeah, so like that potential to exporting to Europe, to Northeast Asia, it's essentially what we've seen is that has just moved to the right. So it's just facing delays for all of the challenges we've been talking about already. We still believe the fundamentals for imports of hydrogen ammonia into those markets remains. They're still large markets that will require imports. They're simply moving much more slowly than expected. So, in the case of the Middle East, those markets that were targeting exports, they're having to adjust to that pace that is ongoing within Europe and Northeast Asian markets like Japan and Korea. But in the Middle East itself, they're also exploring other opportunities, whether that be trying to create higher value hydrogen-derived products in region for export, or potentially accelerating plans for adoption of low carbon hydrogen in domestic markets, which is again, is we're seeing all of those Middle East markets work very actively on those. And finally, the Middle East markets, they're also watching those other potential exporters very closely, because if we look at the US, which was the big competitor for the Middle East into the traded seaborne market, the US is still moving forward in some of those blue hydrogen, blue ammonia projects, but green electrolytic projects in the US have really begun to stall due to some changes in incentives within that market. But actually, the bigger risk that certainly most developers and policymakers in the Middle East are watching very closely is that emergence of China and India as potential exporters into the market, which 2-3 years ago wasn't really on the radar for most people. So this is an emergence of two very large markets, which are making quite tremendous promises about what sort of cost they can bring low carbon hydrogen into the market at.
Indeed, Murray, because looking at India's latest green ammonia auctions, my next question is about how do you view India's ultra-competitive green ammonia auction prices lately? Are they sustainable through construction and operations, or do you think they're going to likely unravel at execution?
It's very much a mixed picture for the Indian projects. So, many of those Indian projects have bid very aggressively into auctions for opportunities to produce hydrogen and export it as ammonia. Not all of those bids have the same competitive advantages as the next. So we think that some of those projects who have bid very aggressively and are promising very low costs can actually progress because they've got that right combination of factors, whether it's power sourcing strategies for the green hydrogen, whether it's being able to capture some additional subsidies, or whether it's leveraging some of those existing brownfield infrastructure and facilities that they have in the Indian market. So some of the projects are able to bring those things together and will probably be very competitive and will go through and progress to FID and operations. But there's also a number of projects within the Indian market which we don't think have quite that right combination of advantages. And so some of those projects are likely to fail to progress.
Finally, on infrastructure timing risk, are delays in transport and storage and in import infrastructure, are they now the binding constraint on hydrogen deployment? And more importantly, how far ahead of production must these investments realistically be made?
The timing question is always very difficult, and it's something that industry, policymakers, everyone wrestles with. But what everyone really agrees on is that it's that enabling infrastructure, the transport, whether it's pipeline and the storage required. Those are the things that are going to offer real scale to this nascent industry. They allow developers to take on much more risk because it gives them access to more off-takers. It allows off-takers to access lower cost supplies. That helps competition in the market. Now, we also need to, though, be realistic about developing large pipeline infrastructure. This is not a quick or a cheap endeavor. Everyone understands it has to be done. Policymakers continue to work on it. But the real challenge is that how do you align that right blend of incentives across the value chain, not just for the producers or the off-takers, but also that really important piece at the middle. And some of those challenges they're simply symptomatic of trying to set up a brand new industry, the potential for a new tradable commodity. There aren't many shortcuts to doing that. It's going to require persistence from industry and from policymakers, but importantly also for those entities to work collaboratively and, on both sides probably make some concessions in order to just actually get the industry started and to get it moving forward and to allow everyone to realize some of the benefits that low carbon hydrogen can actually bring to many markets around the world.
So finally, Murray, after a bad 2025 for hydrogen, you think 2026 will be more of the same? What are your thoughts?
I truly believe that the industry is probably beginning to turn a corner in terms of, a lot of the bad news that we faced through 2025. We're probably out of the depths of that. What I would say though is that a lot of the good news that we might see this year probably comes from China. We're really starting to see progress and low costs being realized. So we might probably see very little activity in some markets like the US, Europe probably beginning to turn the corner. But can China and India actually start to deliver? We think so, and that is what will start to gradually build more momentum again. So yes, out of the depths of 2025, we believe yes.
في سياق حديثنا عن الهيدروجين النظيف وفرص إنتاجه محلياً بهدف التصدير، تشير دراسة لمركز الملك عبدالله للدراسات البترولية كابسارك عام 2024 إلى أن تكلفة إنتاج الهيدروجين الأخضر في السعودية أقل بنحو 25% مقارنة بإنتاجه في ألمانيا، إذ يتراوح الاستثمار المطلوب لإنتاج 213 ألف طن سنوياً ما بين 6.2 و 8.2 مليار دولار في السعودية، وهذا بالمقارنة مع تكلفة الاستثمار في ألمانيا ما بين 8.1 إلى 9.8 مليار دولار في ألمانيا، ويشمل ذلك مشاريع الطاقة المتجددة وأجهزة التحليل الكهربائي. ويرجع هذا الفارق أساساً إلى انخفاض تكلفة الكهرباء الشمسية في السعودية مقارنة بالكهرباء المنتجة من الرياح في ألمانيا. لكن ما زال هناك حاجة إلى تحويل الهيدروجين السعودي إلى أمونيا خضراء بهدف التصدير، ما يضيف نحو $1 للكيلوغرام. وبحسب كابسارك تتراوح التكلفة المستوية لإنتاج الهيدروجين الأخضر السعودي Levelized Cost of Hydrogen شاملاً تكاليف الشحن ما بين $3.34 و $4.08 للكيلوغرام، هذا مقابل $3.06 إلى $3.69 للكيلوغرام في ألمانيا، ما يؤكد قدرة المنتج السعودي على المنافسة في السوق الألمانية. كما تتمتع السعودية بميزة إضافية تتمثل في قدرتها على خفض المعدل المرجح لكلفة رأس المال المعروفة ب Weighted Average Cost of Capital WACC نتيجة قوة تصنيفها الائتماني ومرونة هيكل التمويل، ما يعزز تنافسية المشاريع في السعودية، خصوصاً إذا تجاوز الفارق حوالي 200 نقطة أساس بينها وبين أي مشروع مماثل في ألمانيا. وتخلص الدراسة إلى أن وفرة الموارد الشمسية وانخفاض التكاليف الرأسمالية وقوة الوضع المالي للمملكة تجعل الهيدروجين الأخضر السعودي قادراً على المنافسة في السوق الأوروبية مستقبلاً حتى دون دعم حكومي. بهذا مشاهدينا نصل إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من مستقبل الطاقة. للمزيد تابعونا على منصة X تحت وسم #مستقبل الطاقة، ويمكنكم مشاهدة حلقات البرنامج كاملة على موقعنا الإلكتروني العربية.net/programs. شكرا لكرم متابعتكم، إلى اللقاء.